History department. If you are a non-observant Jewish person, which would be why you're here tonight, happy year 5768. Tonight's program is here because of our one of our Dole senior fellows, Jennifer Schmidt. And I'll say a little bit more about her in a second. But this program really owes its existence to her and her study group. First, let me tell you about a few of our upcoming events. It's getting into high season here at the Dole Institute of Politics. On Tuesday, September 18th, we have a program for Constitution Day. This is one of those unfunded federal mandates that we've tried to make something positive out of. We're going to have a Constitution Day program here on the topic of the John Roberts Court. So we're going to talk about the Chief Justice, who will be here in the spring on campus. And it's going to have some great people. Representative Pat Colleton, from the Kansas State House, Judge Steve Lieben, Burdett Loomis, who's in the audience here, and Steve McAllister of the law school will moderate. Thursday, September 20th is one I can't wait to see how this one turns out. I called it, so you blame me for this wordy title, World Hotspots, What Google Earth and Geography Tell Us About War, Peace, and Politics. I had to take a breath after that. With Professor Jerry Dobson of the Geography Department, Brian McClendon, who invented Google Earth, and is the reason if you boot up Google Earth on your computer and zoom down, it goes right to the Meadowbrook Apartments down the road there. And Alexander Murphy, who's a professor of geography at the University of Oregon. Wednesday, September 26th, we have a really kind of a special treat. A KU graduate student who's also a major in the United States Army has given some amazing classified briefings to senior people and senior business leaders in Iraq about the Iraqi government. They've been declassified and he's going to share them with us. So if you want to know what's going on with the government of Iraq, he's going to be very candid and let you know why some things are working and why way more things ain't working. That's Major Andrew Harvey here on Wednesday the 26th. Finally, we have a duo of programs that I'm really excited about. We're promoting them together for obvious reasons. Bob Shrum, who's run the last two Democratic presidential campaigns, and then 6 others besides that. It's going to come on October 2nd, 7:30 p.m. here. A week later, Mark McKinnon, who's former chief media advisor to President George W. Bush and currently on the McCain campaign, if it's still going on. Has anyone heard anything different? Okay, McCain's still running for president. As usual, tonight we'll have a Q&A after our conversation. If you have a question, please raise your hand. One of our excellent student workers will find you with a handheld mic. Please ask a question, no speeches, and a book signing will follow the program tonight. To introduce our guest, I want to introduce our Dole Senior Fellow, Jennifer Schmidt, who has really been a joy to get to know this semester. She's done a lot of great things for us already. Her study group meets every Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And her topic is Women in Politics Career Stories. She's already had 3 terrific people. If you're free at Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock, please come join us. Jennifer has done a lot of things. She was a KU law grad. She's worked in 2 senators' offices, Senator Dole and Senator Chuck Grassley. She was counsel to Senator Grassley. And she's also been a chief of staff for the Kansas Speaker of the House, if you remember Kent Glasscock. She has a wonderful career in politics. We are delighted to have her here at the Dole this semester. Welcome to Jennifer Schmidt.
Thank you, Dr. Earl. I appreciate it. And hopefully, if you like the program tonight, which I'm sure you will, not because of me, but because of our guest, please join us Wednesdays at 4 o'clock for the study group. I'm trying to gracefully correct you. You didn't. I was hoping nobody would notice, and you just turned yourself in. We're very, very lucky, in my opinion, to have with us an amazing woman. And I will anybody who has talked to me in about the last 2.5 weeks, whether you are my family, my friends, or random people I have run into, or people who visited the Dole Institute, I have probably come up to you holding this book with this picture and said, you have to come back on September 12th, because there's this amazing woman I saw on C-SPAN, and then I went and bought her book and I read her book, and she's terrific, and you have to meet her. I sent her a letter, I called her to follow up, and she called me back with her cell phone number. I have her cell phone number. And accepted our invitation, so she is here. She is doing us the favor of a visit. So by way of introduction, her name is Connie Schultz. As most of you know, you wouldn't be here. She is currently a columnist for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and she's also a syndicated columnist for Creators Syndicate. She has been the recipient of many, many honors and awards in journalism, and I listed them earlier. I'm going to list them again, although she sort of rolls her eyes because she's a very modest person, but I'm very proud of what she's done, and I think that's important to recognize it. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2005. Her outstanding work has also been recognized by earning the Scripps Howard Award and National Headliners Award, the James Batten Medal. In 2003, she won the Best of Show in the National Headliner Awards competition for her narrative series, The Burden of Innocence, which chronicled the life of a man wrongly incarcerated for rape. In addition, the series won the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Social Justice Reporting and was, in addition, a finalist that year for the Pulitzer Prize in Feature Writing. She has also, yes, the list goes on, been an American Society of Newspaper Editors finalist for commentary, was named Best Feature Writer in the state by the Associated Press Society of Ohio, and was an American Association of Sunday and Feature Editors Award for Best Short Feature. She is the author of 2 books, And His Lovely Wife, and which is a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. She's also written Life Happens and Other Unavoidable Truths. Both will be, this is my plug because she won't do this, but they're going to be on sale afterwards at our request, not at hers, and she will be available to sign them. She is married to United States Senator Sherrod Brown, who's currently in his first term representing Ohio in the United States Senate. She has 2 children and 2 stepchildren, so please join me in welcoming the woman I'm trying to get to come to my house for Thanksgiving, because I like her that much, Connie Schultz. Hello?
Oh, can you hear me? I just wish just once people would say they can't hear my voice. I hear it carries.
Why do I get 3 waters and you get 1? I'll share. You can have a water. What was it like to be nominated for and win the Pulitzer Prize?
Can I just thank everyone for being here first? I can't believe you come here on what is tonight, Wednesday? I can't believe you come here on a Wednesday night for this. I want to thank you for that. This is my first trip to Kansas. People are real friendly here.
Everybody's had an Ohio story for you. My parents are originally from Ohio. Everybody else says, oh, my relatives.
I know. The problem is that those stories are always about how they left Ohio, which we've been trying to deal with a little bit. I'm sorry, the question was, what was it?
Oh, that little award, the Pulitzer.
Do you know how they decide the Pulitzer? Would you like to hear how this happens? Because, as she mentioned, I was a Pulitzer finalist in 2003. I thought it was my best shot ever, and if I didn't win it then, I was never going to win it. And right after that, I became a columnist in the fall of 2002. So I'd only been writing a column for a couple of years. And the way the Pulitzers work is, first they have a jury for each category. My category was commentary. And they have between 3 and 5 who judge it. And they're supposed to keep it entirely confidential who the 3 finalists are. So, of course, immediately it is leaked. And except the category for commentary wasn't leaked right away. And we had assumed the Plain Dealer, once again, was not a finalist for anything. We hadn't won a Pulitzer in more than 50 years. Then I was called into the editor's office about a week and a half before the awards are announced, because what happens is they have the juries, and then they have the entire Pulitzer board meet, 21 people, to judge the final body of work. And my editor said I was a finalist, and I said, in what? And he said, well, for the Pulitzer. And I just started laughing. And I said, well, I'm not going to win. You know, it's commentary. So the way it works is they meet on a Friday. That in 2005, it was in April. And I had just landed in New York with my husband. We were going to surprise one of our daughters for her birthday. And we're going to have dinner with her and her then fiance, who's now her husband. And I got a call, because what happens, they decided on a Friday, it's supposed to be entirely confidential until Monday. Immediately it is leaked. and they call editors to let them know. So I'm in a hotel room with my husband getting dressed for dinner when my cell phone rings. And I recognized it as being from the Plain Dealer, but I didn't know whose number it was. And the editor of the paper at that time, and we had gone about 10 rounds. So when he identified himself, I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, do you have bad news for me?" And he said, and Sherrod, my husband, is standing right in front of me, and he said, "Well, is it bad news to win the Pulitzer Prize?" So I'm standing there, and Sherrod's going, "Did you win? Did you win? Did you win?" And I'm trying to have a conversation with my editor. And finally, I look at Sherrod, trying to hold it all, and I nodded, and I said, "Yes." And what does my husband do? He starts to cry. So that's how I found out that I won the Pulitzer Prize. And it changes, and perhaps it changes your life more when you are from not one of the big papers on the coast. And commentary is one of the few categories where it's always just one person. So it's kind of funny to watch the dynamic when you win the Pulitzer because, first of all, being in Cleveland, being a kid of the working class, I come from the working class and everyone knew that because I'd written a lot about it. I immediately had 45,000 relatives in the city of Cleveland. And it was great. They were just so proud. But the message that most resonated for me that I've never been able to forget, I had about 4,500 emails in the first 24 hours. And my voicemail holds 80, and it just kept filling and filling. And I kept trying to listen so the secretaries wouldn't have to take them. But I got a message from a father who starts by saying, "I'm a factory worker, and I have 3 daughters." And then his voice broke, and he hung up. And about 30, 40 messages later, he comes back on. He says, "Well, I'm a factory worker. I'm the one who called. I'm sorry, I kind of lost on you there." He said, "I just want to tell you this. I'm a factory worker like your daddy." And he said, "And I have 3 daughters, and I make them read you all the time because I tell them, see, her daddy was a factory worker, and look how she turned out." And that kind of message, as I'm sure you can understand, both broke my heart and lifted me sky high because what he's saying is, see, girls, I'm just a factory worker, but so was her daddy. And so that's why the Pulitzer has meant so much to me because no matter where I go, I have people come up and tell me that they work for the railroad, or they work for their daddy worked for the utility company, or their mother worked for hospice like my mother did, and how proud they are of me all over the country. And so it has legs, as we say. And it's really mattered a great deal to me because I won it mostly for the work I did on fighting for people who don't get to fight for themselves. I was raised by a mother who said, "Don't marry him until you see how he treats the waitress." Yeah. And I guess I took that lesson to heart.
In your book, "And His Lovely Wife," a perfect title, in my opinion, a memoir from the woman beside the man, what you write about is your husband's Senate campaign for U.S. Senate. And your life on the campaign trail, what it meant for you, what it meant for him. It tells a lot about the campaign, but it also tells about how you dealt with it. When you married him, or even when you first met him, did you know you would end up here? And would you still be here?
Sherrod hates when I say this, but if I had ever interviewed him as a journalist, if I had ever even done a phone interview with him, I would never have gone out with him. Because, we have this little thing called ethics. And I had been a single mother for 11 years when Sherrod first sent me an email right after I started writing a column and said, "Where in the world did the Plain Dealer find you?" which revealed he had not been reading me for the last 8 years. His mother's from Georgia, and she always says to me, "Connie, I'm sorry my son wasn't reading you. I always read you." But then he basically sucked up to me and compared me to Barbara Kingsolver. But what I loved was that clever of him? He denies it was a suck-up line. Ladies, I ask you. But then he signed it simply Sherrod Brown, Lorain, Ohio. And I was impressed that he didn't sign his title. He was a member of Congress at that point. He was in the House of Representatives. And against all odds, we ended up going out after corresponding for a while. We went out. Our first date was on New Year's Day because it was the only day we were sure he wouldn't be scheduled for anything. We had dinner, and we were engaged by Thanksgiving. Our 4 children were doing the Happy Feet dance all over town because they were grown. Sherrod had been a single dad for 16 years. So it was a very romantic beginning. I was a finalist, as you said, in 2003. So 2004, we got married on my late mother's birthday in April. 2005, I won the Pulitzer, and then several months later, Sherrod announced his run for the Senate. I would not have predicted any of the last 4 or 5 years. It's been quite a ride. But my friend and editor, Kate Medina at Random House, has a great saying. no whining on the yacht.
How did your
Isn't that great? I think that should be my next book title. I just love that.
How did your life change when you married him? Not in the personal way, but because he was in office, because he has a scheduler who probably puts your birthday on that schedule and everybody in the office. The reason I say that, my husband's in office, and I was the only person who didn't know he was surprising me for Valentine's Day. Everybody else, I have this cadre of very nice people who knew what was happening before I did.
That's a very weird feeling, isn't it?
It's a good feeling, but it was a very...
I haven't gotten to good yet. It just, having gone from being a very independent mother, single mom, running my own household, forging my career, trying to be a good mom and a good friend and a good family member, to having people needing to know when my next physical was so that we wouldn't schedule anything during it. It's a very bizarre feeling. It's especially weird during a campaign to have people half your age scheduling, which would explain why you're taking red-eye flights. So that you can get back on the other red-eye flight from California. Because they're, 20, 21? And we're like zombies getting off the plane. And it would explain why they could schedule 8 events for you in a single day. They could do it. So it's been such an adjustment in that way. And the story I should have told, when Sherrod first wanted to go out with me, he sent me an email, could we have lunch? Well, didn't that sound great? And then all of a sudden his scheduler got involved and kept changing the date. And about the third time she called, and I said, I have a very good friend, Andrea Samakis at the paper, and I said, well, I'm done with this. I got another message from his, I'm just calling her. And the whole time I'm talking to her, Andrea's going, no. She wanted me to go out with him, but I said, Pat, we were on a first-name basis, his scheduler and I at this point. She says, well, I'm sorry, but the congressman needs to change the date. And I said, do you have a pencil? And she says, well, yes, I do. And I said, well, could you take this down, please? The Camp David peace accords were easier to schedule than lunch with the congressman, and I'm no longer interested. And she said, oh, I can't write that. And I said, oh, yes, you can, and you must, Pat. So she did, and 3 weeks passed, and all of a sudden, I'm getting emails from Sherrod. Not directly from Sherrod, I'm getting copied, as he writes emails to people on every issue he knows I care about. So that's how we end up having our first date. It was my first experience with a scheduler. Now, we've got a Washington scheduler, and we've got an Ohio scheduler, and I'm still not accustomed to, do you ever take is it the Myers-Briggs test? There's a test you take. I took it years ago. It shows your deference to authority. I was in 3 percentile. So you can imagine how well I'm doing with this whole constrained scheduling. But I'm trying to get used to it. Because I understand, they're on my side, some of them. And they do want to let me know what's going on, and we try to coordinate it. But it's a very different life. Although I'm told corporate wives go through this all the time. This is not an unusual life for an awful lot of wives. It's just unusual for me.
I'm just laughing because I actually had a baby. Well, my husband had a scheduler. And those appointments on the schedule are really interesting.
Yeah, that'd be a little embarrassing.
It's a little embarrassing.
She's 3 inches dilated on September 7th.
It's a little, they try to be anonymous. Appointment with Jennifer. Well, I'm walking around 8 months pregnant. What do you think it is?
Right.
So, yeah. You talk in your book that Senator Brown wisely, I might add as my editorial comment, consulted you greatly before making the final decision to run for the Senate. People were talking to him, asking him to do it, and he always said, no, until you signed off.
Right.
What factors weighed for that decision, yes, what not? You understood it was going to be, you have followed politics enough, you knew what you were getting into to some extent. You knew it would change
only
your life.
to some extent. You can never know fully what you're getting yourself into.
But why would you say yes? What factor said yes? What factor said no? We really shouldn't do this.
When Sherrod, first of all, never believe a politician who tells you, I didn't want to do it, but the people want me to run. Because you don't want a politician, you don't want somebody running to lead who doesn't really think he's, out of all the millions of people, he's the one. Of course they think they should, too. It helps when and I married into a very political family, so there was a lot of family pressure that Sherrod should run. I had several concerns. We had only been married 1.5 years. And I was really concerned about what a statewide, year-long race could do to our marriage. I also was very concerned about what it could do to my career. The usual career move is not to win the Pulitzer and a few months later take a leave of absence from your career to work for your hubby. I was also really concerned about how ugly the race could be. We knew that Karl Rove would be directly involved in my opponent's race, And regardless of your politics, I think we all can acknowledge that those races can get pretty ugly. And I was gravely concerned. I'm not overstating it. And so I was really the holdout. I didn't want him to run. He was in a safe House seat. He was risking everything. No one thought Sherrod could win. I mean, no one. We could, and I'll talk more about that later if we get a chance. But a few things happened. One was we were finally living under one roof together because when we first got married, my daughter was a teenager still in high school. And I figured she'd had enough upheaval, and we weren't going to move across town and take her out of her high school right before she graduated. With teenagers, this is such a teenager way of saying that she cared about Sherrod. Because at first, as she said, he fills every room. He's just a big personality, and she was used to just the two of us. And we were watching C-SPAN one night, which is what happens to you when you start dating a member of Congress. You're watching C-SPAN at night instead of Law and Order. And we were waiting for him to get on the House to give a speech. And I was needle pointing. And my daughter all of a sudden said, she was 16, she said, Mom, I do care about Sherrod. And I kept needle pointing. I said, that's nice, honey. I wasn't going to go any further than that. And she said, yeah, if he died, I'd cry. So I called Sherrod that night and said, you're in. So we finally got Caitlin off to school and to college, my daughter, and she's the youngest of the four. And we moved into this house that, it's not huge, but it's huge by my standards of what I was used to. I rented a duplex for 11 years in Shaker Heights, Ohio, so my daughter could be in a good school system. I couldn't possibly have afforded to buy a house there. And Sherrod lived on the other side of town, so we moved there. We bought a house that was 3 years old. And I'll never forget the moment when we had just gotten settled in, and Sherrod said, wow, I haven't lived in a house like this since I was a kid. And I looked and thought, in their wildest dreams, my parents could not have imagined a house like this. And I started to comprehend how much my life was changing and how comfortable we were getting when so much was going wrong in the country. And I would listen to my husband on the phone and watch his face when he would talk as he encouraged other people to run for various offices, including Ted Strickland, who ran for governor and won. And he would talk about this is the time. This is a chance for us to change the direction of our country. And he would talk about the war, and he would talk about jobs, and he would talk about health care, and all the millions of Americans who didn't have health care. And I watched him, and I realized something. He really wanted to run, but he loved me more than that. And the only thing that would stand in his way would be me. And that did not set well. And I wanted us to have the right answer for the grandchildren we don't have yet. And we fully expect our children to raise the kind of grandchildren who will say, so what did you do? What was it like back then, Grandma and Grandpa? What did you do? I didn't think it was a good answer to say, well, Grandpa had a safe house seat that he didn't want to lose. And Grandma was really enjoying writing that column and just wanted to stay put. So we made an agreement. We had some agreements about Sherrod's race. He was going to run as a true progressive in Ohio because we knew a true progressive could win in Ohio because the progressive's politics were right in line with the family values of most Americans and certainly those in Ohio. We were going to learn from the mistakes John Kerry made in Ohio. John Kerry's campaign only ran about half of the 88 counties in our state. And he lost. He only won, I think, 16 counties. Sherrod ended up winning 46. We were going to have an operation in every single county. I didn't know at that time I would visit more than 60 of them myself. And we were not going to be separated on weekends. The typical MO for a campaign is, a wife is either a prop or a problem. And if they find out that the wife can string together a verb and a subject and a noun and chicken, they want her on the road all the time, and they hardly ever see each other. Well, I had a marriage to protect. And Sherrod and I agreed on this, and as it turned out, his campaign manager, when we finally found one who agreed to manage, nobody wanted to take it around the country. They just didn't think he could win. And he won by almost 13 points, I'm happy to report. But we didn't know that back then, that was going to happen. And his campaign manager decided that Sherrod did better when I was with him. And there's not a wife in the room who would be surprised by that. And probably most husbands, because nobody understands each other in a marriage like the two people in it. And my only agenda in the campaign was my husband. And I was the one who looked out for it. I'll never forget after the final debate, we're driving and he's doing a radio interview and he falls asleep during the interview. He's like this, and all of a sudden I look at him. Whenever Sherrod falls asleep, his mouth hangs open. I said, Sherrod! And I shake him, and he starts talking again. And I immediately got on the phone with the campaign manager. He's over scheduled. We had 4 more events that night yet. And I said, we got to cut back, because we knew at that point, that was towards the end of the campaign, a tired candidate is a candidate who makes mistakes. And that's what we needed to prevent. So we ended up in the last month, they had me with them all the time. And they have built some memories that we'll never forget. Because sometimes it's not about what you talk about. It's even just being able to reach over and grab your hand. Because you've just, we heard so many sad, hard stories on the road. It's very humbling to have people who have no reason to have hope anymore show up because they believe you can make a difference. That'll keep you up at night, I'll tell you. And so when he'd wake up at night, think about that, I was there for so many of those, that we could talk about the people we met, and we could talk about why we're doing this.
You talk in your book a lot about how your life changed, good parts, but also parts that challenged you professionally, and your column and how you eventually had to take a leave of absence from the paper, from writing that, and we're full-time with him. I'm going to read a quote from the book that particularly struck me. I was straddling two worlds, not taking up residence in either of them and feeling lost much of the time. When I look back on it, I can see that what I most feared was that the Connie I knew, the writer I'd known for years, was evaporating. I looked at the long road ahead and thought, wow, I could lose the marriage I cherish, the career I love, and the me I know by the time the campaign is over. It seemed like a lot to lose. How did you combat that during the campaign?
Well, understand that part of the reason I felt that way so quickly is 2 weeks into the campaign, somebody tried to steal our trash. I was looking out our front window. We had just moved to this neighborhood, and two guys in suits are picking up our trash. And I thought, wow, this community really does it differently. And then I realized that the van is unmarked, and they're looking around as they're picking it up. And so, being the lady that I am, I open the door and I start screaming, put down our trash! What are you doing with my trash? And our poor pug, who's almost blind and nearly deaf, was barking so hard that only one paw was touching the ground. You know how that works. She's doing that Dino bark. So they dropped it. And in that moment I thought, oh my God, not only is this going to be a nasty campaign, but I am starring in a B movie. So there was so much to get used to right away. And when I first started, I took a leave of absence because I could not write the column I used to write for fear of appearing that I was trumpeting my husband. Now, anybody who, you get married in middle age, you better have a lot in common, right? Of course we agreed on a lot of the issues, but all that evaporates especially because we were fairly unprecedented. So, and my colleagues were skittish, and I thought some of my colleagues would recuse themselves. I'd been in the delivery room of the birth of one of their children, one of the reporters. Another one, I had coached his daughter in softball for several years, and another one had come to our wedding. But as it turned out, none of them were recusing themselves. And they were overcompensating. I understand why they did it. But they were hammering my husband in coverage constantly. And I realized that my staying there was affecting my work. It was affecting all my relationships in the newsroom that mattered to me. And it could potentially imperil my husband's candidacy. So I left in mid-February. And I really felt lost for a while because I had gone from being a woman paid to give her opinion to giving my husband's opinion free everywhere I went. And I was boring myself. I was, a lot of wives will tell you, well, I never talk policy. Well, nobody was going to believe I couldn't talk policy when I've been writing about policy. That wasn't going to work. But it's so weird to say, well, Sherrod would say that, Sherrod would do that, Sherrod, blah, blah. I was getting bored. And the other thing that was happening is, especially a certain kind of man, usually an older man, was really objecting to my not having changed my name. Now, I married Sherrod when I was 46 years old, and he was 51. It seemed kind of silly to me to change my name. And at first, I would just keep explaining, well, we've only been married less than 2 years, and I have this career. But then I went to a chicken dinner down in southern Ohio. I spent a lot of time in rural and working class parts of the state because I come from that. And it just made sense for me to travel there a lot. And so I was at a chicken dinner with 150 people, and the man who got up to introduce me said, well, Sherrod Brown's wife's here, but she's one of those ladies who won't change her name, so here she is. That's exactly what my staff did. They all looked at me, they tried to smile, and all their smiles evaporated because they were reflecting my face. And I walked up, and what the man didn't know is my father had just died of a heart attack. He died at 69, and my mother was already gone. And I got up and I thought, I am so done with this. So I very calmly said, he's right. I didn't change my name. Let me tell you what it is. My name is Connie Schultz. And I said, I want to tell you why. I said, I've been spending too much time trying to explain to people that the reason I didn't change my name is because I have a career and I'm 46, or I was married Sherrod when I was 46. But that's not really why I don't change my name. I want to tell you about Janie and Chuck Schultz, my parents. And I talked about Janie. She was only 4'11". She used to wear a beehive a lot. She thought it made her look taller. I said, no, Mom, it makes you look like a lady with a very big wasp nest on your head. But she was just a little thing. And she was a nurse's aide. She worked in a mental health ward for a lot of years. She used to come home with bruises on her arms and wear sweaters in the summer to cover them up. And then later in her life, she was a hospice home care provider. The joke used to be when Janie showed up, people lived longer. Because she'd listen to their stories and she'd bathe them. And she was the one who'd hang out for the whole day. She'd have one patient at a time. And she died at 62 of pulmonary fibrosis. And they said it's idiopathic. We don't know the cause. She never smoked. We're starting to think we might know that. And I can tell you that story later. It was very moving, actually, when somebody came up to me after the book came out. So my mother died at 62. And I said, my dad, Chuck, my dad was a member of the utility workers, Local 270. He was a proud union man who worked 36 years in a job he hated every day he was there. He was a factory worker. And I said, my dad, I'll never forget, my dad was one of those guys who would shower after work because he got so dirty, and Mom always washed his clothes separately. And the typical routine is Dad would come home, get a beer or a Rolling Rock, and sit on the front stoop while Mom made supper. And we'd be outside in the nice weather. A lot of times we'd play catch so he could watch us because he was quite the athlete, and he taught us all how to throw a ball right. So I'm the oldest of four, and I would play catch often with my little brother, Chucky. And I'll never forget, I was about a sophomore in college, and I remember throwing the ball once, and my dad started to shake his head. And I thought I'd thrown the ball wrong. And I looked at him and I said, what is it, Dad? And he wouldn't even look at us. He just kept shaking his head, and he said, you could teach a monkey to do what I do. And I said, my dad and my mom, they thought they were two nobodies every day they lived, but they were going to raise four somebodies. And they sent their four kids to college. And their four somebodies were around them the day they died. And I said, so I'm really proud of the name Schultz. And part of the reason I could fall in love with Sherrod Brown is he's been fighting for the people I come from his entire life. Well, the man who introduced me, got tears coming down his face, comes up and he tells the whole crowd, I love the name Schultz. Don't ever change the name Schultz. But what happened for me in that moment, I realized, is I felt like at least a good part of me was back. Because what I do is I tell stories. And I felt like my mom and dad were with me on the campaign trail from there in. My first book came out right before my dad died. I went on the Today Show 2 days after we buried him. And he was so excited to have that book come out. So after that, I started doing what I always do. I took notes. I started talking to people, listening to their stories, taking notes, and then I'd tell their stories on the campaign trail. And I'd talk about the people, and I'd go to these small communities and say, you know what, I met someone just like you. Because she'd say, nobody understands what I'm going through. I've lost my insurance. I said, you know what? I met a woman named Wanda who lives in Youngstown. Let me tell you what happened to her. And all of a sudden, they didn't feel so alone. And what they loved hearing was these are the people who were showing up. And we were getting standing room only crowds, especially with women. It was so funny, because it was simply, I think they kept hearing there's this woman with all these opinions and her husband's not reining her in and he's running for the Senate. So let's go find out who she is. And it was really, I hope that answers that question. That's a long answer, but there's no, I always feel like that's the best way to answer how I made that shift so that I felt more comfortable on the campaign trail.
Because you had professional sacrifices, but there are also personal sacrifices on the campaign trail and in political life. One story that you tell in your book that I read about 3 times because it particularly touched me was the story about your father who died of a heart attack during Sherrod's campaign. And the sacrifices that had to go around a personal event. I mean, you try very hard to protect the marriage, but there's sometimes things that happen, but the campaign and politics still come into play. And the reason I read it 3 times, besides the fact that it was very well written, during my husband's first campaign, both my father and his father passed away with 5 months.
Sorry.
And thank you. But it was interesting that we had to go on and the way we had to deal with it and the things that we missed. I missed his first victory party because I was at the hospital with my father, and bless his heart, he was up at the hospital, went down, celebrated his victory for 3 hours, got in the car and drove back and spent the first week in office with me, which was not the way it was supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit about, you wrote so much about your dad and he was such an important part.
Well, what happened was I was on, because we had already planned the book, I had a whole book of my my opinions coming out in the middle of the campaign. Can we all laugh at just how worried the consultants were for a few days on that? But, so I was on a book tour, but Random House had agreed to limit the national touring and keep it focused in Ohio, because they already knew I was working on the next one, and they figured the next one's going to be the one they were going to pitch broader audience. So I was down in southern Ohio, in Dayton, when I had a voicemail message from my sister Leslie. And she said, Dad, she had found my dad. She and the woman my dad was dating, Teresa, we love her. Dad's had a heart attack. He apparently was not breathing when they found him. He was gray. They resuscitated him. They're rushing him to university hospitals. And then I had a second message. It was my brother, Chucky. You better get up here. It's not looking good. So I was with my friend Jackie. It was the only time I didn't have a Random House driver. Because Jackie had said, she's my best friend, and she said, I'm going to take you. We never see each other anymore. I'm going to take you to Dayton. So we literally turned the car around. We're calling Random House. We're calling the bookstore where I was supposed to go. And Jackie turns to me as I'm sitting there, and she says, you know, Con, maybe it's not as bad as you think. Maybe it's going to be okay. And I said, no, the air is different. I can feel it. So we get up to Cleveland, and Dad was unconscious. He never regained consciousness. He was on every imaginable machine he never wanted. But I can't blame anyone. You know, when they're there to try to save a life, that's what they try to do. So for 2 whole days, he was on life support. And I'm the oldest of 4, as I said, so you never stop being the oldest. You know how that goes. And I've got my siblings there, and Sherrod is calling me constantly. And he says, he's in Washington, and do you want me to come home? Well, of course I did. I wanted nothing more than the only thing I wanted more than that was for Dad to come back to life. But the problem was that there were going to be intelligence votes that week. And Sherrod's opponent had already tried to go after him as being soft on terrorism. And I knew if he missed those votes, that I would have to hear him. First of all, we knew there'd be an ad up within days, another attack ad. And I'd have to hear Sherrod for the next, 6 months, talking about why he missed those votes. And then the crowd would look at me to see my response. And it was just too hard. It was too close. So it was selfish of me in part. I just thought, I cannot go through 6 months of hearing him say, well, Connie's father was dying. So I said, stay. And he came home when Dad died. My dad didn't want a funeral. Now, my mom had calling hours. We had 800 people show up for her calling hours in this little town of Ashtabula. One of my favorite people from the Plain Dealer, Tom Farron, a columnist about so tall, he said it's the longest line he'd ever been in for calling hours. He half expected when he got to the porch of the funeral home, it would say, you must be this tall to get in. But my dad, I think, was afraid no one would show up. So he had stipulated he wanted no funeral, no calling hours. We had a graveside service, buried him 2 days after he died. And Sherrod was there, and he was a pallbearer. But what was really hard, this was one of the hardest moments for my daughter, was when we got home, somebody had snuck in our driveway and put a bush sticker over my car. Not over my Sherrod bumper sticker, but over the bumper sticker that says, well-behaved women rarely make history. So it felt so pointed. And she started to cry. She says, can't they leave us alone for one day? Can't they, don't they? Because everyone knew my father died. The Plain Dealer asked me to write a column about my dad, because I'd written a lot about him. So they asked me to come back to write, so it was very easy to know my dad died. And I turned to her and I just said, honey, there is no respite from the campaign. And what I realized is, even as I was saying it, I was basically acknowledging it for the first time myself. There is no respite from a campaign. So it was not easy, but it's behind us.
In a phone conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, got that look of fear on your face. Like, oh no, what
was it?
We talked about the term trailblazer, because what we've also talked about is the fact that you give voice in this book to a demographic that is not often heard, honestly. It's something else we talked about. Political spouses do not always go up and honestly say, this is what I think, this is the way my life is, and you do in this book. And you said that a lot of people who've come to your book signings, your book tour, have been political spouses because you give them a voice, and you don't want to be a trailblazer. Why do you think you're not a trailblazer?
Well, I just don't want to lay claim to that. I think it's such an honorable title, and I don't know that that's the case for me. I don't know any other way to do this except honestly. I remember seeing Elizabeth Edwards at one point. You know, Elizabeth had her memoir, and I said, Elizabeth, you're much nicer than I am. She goes, in the book, honey. And I just love that. Because for me, there is no point writing this if I wasn't going to write an honest story. I'm a journalist first and foremost. I will always first be a journalist. And there was no point in writing this book unless I was honest about it. And the thing is, I think I can't lay claim to this because I'm seeing some women really blaze their own trails this year. I look at Michelle Obama and Elizabeth Edwards. You look at Jerry Thompson, who's been very involved in political leadership. And I look at Hillary Clinton. You know, and when that stupid, ridiculous story came out about her cleavage, I'm 50. I said, when I'm 60, if anybody's writing about my cleavage, I'm throwing a party and wearing a granny thong. It was just such a dumb story. But what I loved about Hillary is when, on election night, she called Sherrod to congratulate him for winning. And then she said, you tell Connie not to let anyone tell her she can't have this career. And I was so grateful for that. And I went up to her a couple weeks later and I said, Hillary, I'm very aware that you really did, you really cleared that path for women like me. And she joked and said, yeah, and I'm still picking the gravel out of my backside. And she's right. So I feel that I'm really the beneficiary of some pretty amazing women. You know, we were talking earlier tonight with some of the younger women here. And one of the things I said that I wish we were mentoring more younger women. And I think we got to work on that because as I tell women in my generation, you know, we often feel, I'm afraid that either, you know, we had to do it all on our own, they're on their own, or we feel threatened by them because we haven't been in these positions of leadership and we're afraid of losing them. But I think if all we have is our own success, we've left no legacy. And I often tell women my age, you know, we don't have their midriffs, but they don't have our wisdom. And there is a trade-off. But I also tell young women, and this is what I mean about legacy, I think of the year 1917, when those women were arrested for protesting in front of Woodrow Wilson's White House for the right to vote. And it's now called the Night of Terror because they were tortured in prison. They were strung up by chains. One of them had a heart attack. They were beaten. They were bitten. They were kicked. Alice Paul, when she refused to eat, was force-fed until she vomited. And news only got out they were only helped finally when news got out to the press what was happening to them. They did all of that so I could vote. I mean, talk about your ultimate volunteers. And I feel the weight of that legacy. And I at least can talk about it now without getting emotional even. I take it so seriously. That's the legacy that was left for women like me. So I'm a feminist. I understand that's a daring thing to say in some parts of Kansas, I've been told. But, you know, being a feminist never meant figuring out who we could neglect. And it never meant we weren't going to shave our legs ever again. I feel the need to explain this to some people. And I iron my husband's shirts and I make his lunches a lot, but I'm also a feminist, which means I need to cast a very wide net for women. It means women should have all kinds of choices open to them. You want to stay home with your children? You want to try to juggle a career? You want to have no children and still matter in our culture? All of that. That's what it means for me to be a feminist. I've got to support you. So I feel like I'm such a beneficiary, and I am only trying in my own small way to share it. And I think of what one Senate wife said to me. You know, when the Senate wives found out I was writing this book, they started coming up to me and saying, don't forget to include this, and you got to talk about that. And I finally said to one of them who's been a long time Senate wife, I said, you know, I don't have to be the only one speaking up about all this. You women can be talking about this too. And she said, oh, honey, it's way too late for me. And that really hit me. So that's why I wrote the book, in part. I dedicated it to every woman who's ever felt anonymous. I figured that was a pretty long list. You don't have to be married to a politician to get introduced as his lovely wife. You're married to the choir director in a town size 300. You're going to get introduced at some point as his lovely wife. And I meet so many smart, bright, I've met so many bright women today in Kansas. My gosh, what a wealth of talent and intelligence and commitment to things. You have such a wide range of things you care about. And I meet all of you and I think, why don't I know your names? And I know I can't know all of you, but I'm going to too many parts of the country. There's a new book coming out on Friday. Or actually, it just came out. I have a column coming out about it on Friday by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who's the one who wrote Well-Behaved Women Rarely Make History. There's a book now with that title. It actually says seldom. That was her original word. I highly recommend it because it's got so many women in there you will never have heard of before. And I'm telling you, I said in my column, it makes women muscle-flex and proud to read it.
Are we ready now, do you think, to elect a woman president? Are we there?
Yeah. Yeah, I was on Charlie Rose recently. I think some of you saw, because a few have commented. And Charlie started naming the very few women who've ever been president of any country. It's like 3 or 4. And I said, Charlie, 3 does not a majority make. And he kept going on. I finally said, Charlie, I don't know how else to put this. You guys have had more than 200 years in this country. What a fine job you've done. Maybe you should just give one of us a chance. Let's just try one. And of course he immediately said, well, you know I'm with you. You know I love women. You know I support women. And to me, it finally crystallized for me not that many months ago. I wasn't immediately on board with Hillary Clinton. But More Magazine, and some of you women will know what More Magazine is, it's to my generation of women, they excerpted my book and had a luncheon in New York at Gramercy Tavern for me. And Anna Quinlan was there, a dear friend, and Ariana Huffington was there, and all these women of great influence in New York. And they started talking about the Hillary problem. And the problem was, well, there's this problem or there's that problem. Finally, I said, you know what? I've been voting for bozos my entire adult life. Some of them are great, but I voted for a lot of men. None of them were perfect, and some of them were barely passable. But I voted for them. I don't need Hillary Clinton to be perfect. I don't need that. And, there's a lot of talk about how unprecedented it is that her husband is a former president. But frankly, it is unprecedented no matter who this woman would have been, because this is the first time we have a viable candidate in a woman for president. And if you don't like her policies, that's a perfect reason not to vote for her. But I really get frustrated with women who start their sentences about Hillary Clinton by saying things like, well, she's the kind of woman who, or I always hate when women get so aggressive. Don't make it simply about her gender. Now, you could argue I've definitely made it about her gender. And you're right. I've waited a long time in history for this moment. And I want to see what she can do. One chance. Give us one. Just give us one. And let's see what happens.
If the public and the voters are becoming more accepting of women in office, are the roles, the expectations of female spouses also changing? And you recently wrote a column about basically saying lay off the candidates' wives. Is it changing, or is it just more
I think
of the
we're
same?
adjusting. We're recalibrating to women who actually act like real wives. I think one of the reasons people like Elizabeth Edwards, women do, is they look at her and think, oh, that's my marriage. I disagree with my husband sometimes, too. Do you know a healthy marriage where the wife never disagrees with the husband? How boring is that cocktail party? But here's the thing, too, about a woman president. I wish I could remember her name. She's an African-American woman who's head of the Women's Trial Lawyers branch of the Trial Lawyers Association. They have a new name. I'm drawing a blank on their name. But she was for Hillary early, and I said, I'm curious. Why are you for Hillary? And she said, if we have a woman president, jurors are going to believe me more. And if we have a woman president, more women are going to get become tenured professors. And if we have a woman president, more women are going to become superintendents of public school districts. And she just started listing it. And I thought, I see the argument. That if you get used to the idea of a woman at the very top, again, that carry as you climb. I could see it now. As far as political wives, I think it's very healthy that you're seeing real women be real wives to their husbands out there. But the thing is, they always were privately. It's just now they're acting like it in public. And I think of what a friend once gave me, a definition of resentment. Resentment is when you drink the poison and expect the other person to hurt. And I meet a lot of really resentful political wives who for too long feel they've been performing in public. And they've had to give up so much of themselves so that their husbands can keep doing what they do. Well, guess what? Turns out I don't think you do have to give up all that about yourself for your husband to get elected. I mean, I've had political wives write me some very moving letters. And one woman's husband is running for governor in a primary. And she said, they're giving me so much advice. They're telling me how to act, how to talk. And they're telling me to wear a lot of beige. Where do they come up with this stuff? And she said, what advice would you give? And I said, well, all I can tell you is this. In the middle of the campaign, an entire book of my opinions came out. And Sherrod won by almost 13 points. And I'm not saying I helped him get elected, but I sure didn't hurt him. Because they're not voting for me. And I had so much fun meeting people who, I cannot tell you how many times they'd say, well, you're real. Well, all of the wives are real, but they don't feel like they can act like they're real. And that's what I'm hoping. The book helps move us along a little bit. I've been really surprised at the amount of interviews I've done. I had not anticipated the interest in this. And I do think it's because we're starting to get shamed a little bit into maybe walking the talk. If we say women have all these opportunities and women have a right to their own viewpoints, shouldn't we be treating wives that way?
Putting on your journalist hat again for a minute. After living through Senator Brown's campaign, how would you cover a political campaign differently now than you would have BSB, before Sherrod Brown?
You know, one of the things I've encouraged journalists about is the regional journalists, you really ought to own your territory. Nobody should be able to parachute in and do the story you can do. And they can't if you're allowed to own the coverage. I thought regional reporters did a pretty good job overall. I did feel, I have nothing against middle-aged white men, but if that's all I'm seeing on the campaign trail covering it, I get concerned because it's only one perspective. And I was alarmed to see how much of that was still going on in 2006. Because I think women bring a different set of sensibilities to campaign coverage. Although lately I've been trying to chastise them for all the coverage of the wives. I don't quite know what happened with that. So overall, it was kind of fun sometimes to watch coverage. For example, Sherrod had a primary opponent for a while, and the opponent got out. And Rush Limbaugh got on the air and said that my husband's name was Sherrod Brown, not Sherrod. And the reason they wanted him and not the other guy is because Sherrod Brown is an African American. 2 days later, Fox TV, I found out, I was sitting at a restaurant, and a waitress came up and said, Ms. Schultz, I was with my friend Jackie. She says, do you mind, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you know, Fox TV just said that your husband's name is Sherrod Brown, and he's a woman. Jackie immediately says, oh, that explains so much. So I had to speak to about 150 women 2 days later. I said, so you see, I'm even more liberal than you thought. I'm actually married to an African-American woman. So sometimes the coverage was just ridiculous. I did find that national reporters, and there were some exceptions, and I noted them in my book, but they would come in, they really do, they kind of parachute it. Has this state gone through the examination? You know what I'm talking about. They know all they need to know about Kansas after spending 6 hours here, right? And they don't know Kansas like you know Kansas. They don't know Kansas like you know Kansas. And but my concern is that newspapers, television stations, radio stations are all cutting their budgets so dramatically, and what suffers is the local coverage. I mean, there is no reason a presidential candidate comes in this state, no way should the New York Times have a better story of that visit and what your readers are thinking about that candidate than Kansas papers, Kansas television stations, Kansas radio stations. There is no way they should have better coverage than you. And that's the argument now to be making and I really think if you don't like the coverage, you should be letting them know. Because they pay attention to letters to the editor, they pay attention to calls to the editor. I know because before I won the Pulitzer, I felt like I was being called into the principal's office twice a week. They pay attention to it. And even if your letter doesn't run, they keep track of what they're getting, and they keep track of where the opinion's going. And you have a right to demand good coverage. Because really, we're the last stop, especially like with the ads. Most papers have given up on ad watches, which is one of the most crucial services I think journalists provide during campaigns. They tell you where the ads lie, where they're not truthful. And if you lose that, you've lost a very important public service that journalists perform.
You tell a story in your book about when Jack Dover, who was Senator Brown's longtime chief of staff, told you over dinner at the beginning of the campaign that you were going to be a different person at the end of the campaign. What did he mean, and was he right?
Well, he wouldn't tell me what he meant. Jack had been a long time lobbyist and political operative. He said, you're going to be different at the end of this. And people often ask me, what's it like to be a senator's wife? And I keep saying, I'll let you know. Because I don't really understand totally how I'm getting... You start to understand incrementally how your lives are changing in some ways, and it takes some getting used to. And but I still think I have every right to have certain boundaries in place for myself and who I will and will not be simply because of what my husband does for a living now. I don't think of myself as married to a United States senator. I'm married to Sherrod. He's the guy who pins his socks before he throws it in the laundry so they don't separate during the rinse cycle. And he's the guy who still makes my coffee whenever he's home, and he takes care of the pet. I mean, he's a real guy to me. And what's interesting about being in the Senate in part is people either want to vilify your husband or deify him. Neither of those are good, trust me. It was interesting to recently have Sherrod named one of the top 50 most beautiful people in Washington by the magazine The Hill. No middle-aged wife needs her husband to be called the most beautiful anything. So there's a lot of getting used to it. What I've noticed about myself is more about my personal politics. Before the campaign, I was a feminist up here. I had all the talking points. I intellectually understood why women... Now I'm in it here because I temporarily lost my identity on the campaign trail, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I knew I was going to go back. I was going to get back to my platform. I was going to be able to write this book But what I also knew is that most women never get the chance I have. So what am I going to do about that? So what I've really made a conscious effort to do is, I've always done this some, but in my columns now, I mention more women. I find women experts more. I talk about individual women and when they have extraordinary stories in the smallest and the greatest of ways. I mean, recently I found there was a little ad in our, I don't know if your paper has it, but there was this little memorial ad, and it was a boy's picture with his dog. And you can read it and see that what happened is the boy died a few years ago, and now the dog has died. So I contacted her. It turned out she'd been a single mother most of that time. And her son, at 4, he had always wanted a dog. And she said, because she was a responsible single mother and renter, which you don't have to say, you just tell the story. You can't have one until we own our own home, because we can't ask that of a landlord. And so when they had their own home, he finally got his dog. And Cricket. And he picked the ugliest dog at the pound. And she said, he's bow-legged. And he said, she's perfect. And a year and a half after he had the dog, they were inseparable. He would come home every day and play with him. The little boy, not so little, 14 at that point, got on his bike, said, I'll be back for supper, and got hit by a train. And so Cricket, as long as Cricket was alive for the next 7 years, a little bit of her son was alive still, too. And when he died, she wanted everyone to know that there was a boy who used to love a dog named Cricket. And I ended by saying that, people tell her, well, now he's in heaven with the dog. And she doesn't know if that's true. But what she does know, because what her son once said when they found a stray cat and it ended up having leukemia, you know how that goes, you get that feline leukemia, and they had to put the cat down, and he was distraught. He was 11. And she said, he kept saying, does he know we love him? Does he know we don't want this to happen? Does he know it wasn't supposed to end this way? So I ended the column by simply saying, she said she doesn't know if they're in heaven together, but she does know this. It was not supposed to end this way. And we got mail from all over the country. And it's a chance to hold up a single mom who did all the right things. And so I think that's where I've become sensitized in a way I hadn't before. Is I told you what my mom said about you don't marry him until you see how he treats the waitress. The whole idea is how you mistreat people you're allowed to mistreat. That's the measure of who you are. And so I try to write about the people who you're allowed to mistreat. My parents were two people who were allowed to be mistreated. We have a chance every time we go out in public to mistreat people if we want to, right? Clerks, valets, the dry cleaner clerk, the server at the restaurant. We make a decision every day. Who are we as people? Who am I as an individual? How am I going to treat this person? So I've already had that sensibility because of my parents. But now I've got this added layer to it, I think. And it's not that, I love men. I write a lot of columns about men. I don't think I need to explain that. Excuse me. It's just that I'm tired of so many good people being ignored.
I think it's time to open it up for questions. I've gotten an excellent opportunity to talk to our guest. We have two students, Corey and Clarissa, who are going to have microphones. I'm going to ask that you speak in, ask your question clearly. Please ask questions. Our time is somewhat short, so we want to get in as many questions as we can and take advantage of our guest being here. So who would like, I believe the gentleman back here was the first with his hand up, and then I'll get to you.
In our local paper, we get the commentary of Leonard Pitts, who won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize. That made me wonder what journalists in your line of commentary you greatly admire.
Leonard's a friend. I have a lot of respect for Leonard. He's been very supportive of me. Anna Quinlan, I've always felt, was the gold standard for me as a columnist. And Anna's a friend now, but she wasn't when I first admired her work, especially when she wrote for the New York Times as a columnist. Because I thought Anna did a very good job. In fact, it was called Public and Personal. Private and Public, that's what it was called, when she won the Pulitzer Prize. Because she had a way of taking her own life or things that were very personal and make them about bigger issues and show how they actually reflect the bigger issues. And I've always thought she was a really fine columnist. I don't like a lot of the voice of God kind of columnists. You must do this. My editor early on said, write some personal columns too as you go, because then people who don't agree with you politically will still see you got things in common. At least they'll be willing to listen. And I think he was right, because what I want to do when I write is I want to have a conversation. And I don't like being lectured, do you? I don't want to be lectured. I don't learn anything from somebody lecturing me. It's more challenging sometimes as a columnist. And if you write personal ones, you're more prone to personal attacks then, because they feel they know you. But I got to tell you, it warms my heart when people come up to me and they've been reading my column and they call me Connie and they say, "I hope you don't mind, but I feel I know you." And they tell me a story about their lives right at that because they know I want to hear it. So I hope that Leonard's great. He's got a lot of guts. You can't imagine the hate mail he gets just because he's black. It's scary, really scary sometimes.
Okay, how about this gentleman up here and then Dr. Cudd. Okay, we're coming.
I can speak louder.
Oh, if you don't mind, thank you. I appreciate it.
Just to follow up on his question, are all the best commentators liberal or progressive? And more seriously, who do you admire as a writer that has a more conservative bent?
That was a trick question. I'll tell you what. No, I don't think only liberal columnists are the best. I tend to agree with them more. But we're in the minority in newspapers. They just did a big study that came out, and there are very few newspapers in the country where it's not really heavily weighted to conservative columnists, which is one of the reasons I stayed in Cleveland, because I like being a progressive voice in the Midwest. I don't agree with George Will a lot of the time. I think he's an incredible writer a lot of the time. And I like some of the issues he picks, particularly about his son with Down syndrome. He's been very articulate on that. I don't read a lot of columnists because I'm trying to figure out my own opinion on things. And I find that if I get too many other voices in my head, I spend too much time worrying that I'm sounding like somebody else. I don't have another answer for you, and then I'm sorry, I probably disappoint you, but I don't have a lot of favorite liberal columnists either. I read, you know what, a lot of my spare time, I carve out a lot of time to read fiction.
On planes.
In planes and in bed. I mean, I really like to read literature a lot. I just reread Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and then used a scene from it in a column I wrote about a child who was killed in a poor neighborhood in Cleveland. I really love the lyricism of good fiction. It makes me think harder about the writing. I care a lot about the writing. I don't think of myself often. I don't call myself a liberal very often. I get called that a lot. And I am certainly, my politics are more that way. But when you read, one of my favorite kind of responses I get a lot are from conservatives who say, "I hate when you write about this or this, but I loved your column on this." And as I have said many times, I'm looking to build bridges. We got enough gullies and divides. I really want to have conversations. So I hope that answers somewhat where you're going with it.
Okay, Dr. Cudd. Corey, Clarissa, can we? No, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Very much enjoyed your talk, so
Thank you.
thanks for coming. Moderation was great, too.
She's been great. I love her.
Absolutely. You suggested that sometimes you disagree with your husband.
Yes.
I assume over political issues
Yes.
sometimes. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about whether you actually write about those things or whether you avoid them. And if there's an example you'd like to share with us, that'd be great.
Sure. I don't ever say in my column, well, I disagree with my husband on this, but I will write. And one of the issues definitely is flag burning, because I am a First Amendment purist. And my husband has a lot of veterans, and he can see their argument, and I can see their argument, but I still fall with the First Amendment on that. I also have been I wrote about Larry Craig recently, even though he's a colleague of Sherrod's, because I thought what really concerned me was this. I've done a lot of advocacy for gays and lesbians. And there was a gay blogger, some of you may know this, out of Washington, he had written about Larry Craig before the restroom arrest, and is threatening, he says he has a list of 33 members of Congress who are closeted gays, and he's going to start outing them. And the head of the Human Rights Campaign is opposed to that. He said, this is, what happened when you do that? What you got out of is Larry Craig is a hypocrite, but you didn't talk at all about what it's like to be a closeted gay man in America. And he wants that to be the conversation. So Sherrod, I never let Sherrod see a column before it's been filed and put to bed, because it seems like a safe policy for both of us. You know, he basically, I love this. Occasionally his office will get calls and they've got this written down as script. The senator loves his wife and is very proud of her. Thank you for calling. And you know, it helps that we don't disagree on a lot of things. I'm certainly more outspoken on that issue, partly because Ohio's been particularly harsh with gays and lesbians, and children are really suffering now as a result because a lot of them aren't getting health care coverage because of it, because of partner benefits. And I just think it's just not our issue these days. You know, I think our younger generation is going to take care of it anyway. It's going to be like biracial marriages. It's going to disappear as an issue in 20 years. In the meantime, I'd like us not to be so angry all the time. You know, I was raised by a born-again Christian, my mother. But my mother raised this to me. She said, being a Christian means fixing yourself and helping others, not the other way around. Fixing yourself and helping others. And she would never have supported the issue that we had up to, you know, in 2004. And so I'm bolstered by that with my mother. I mean, my mom was a woman of faith. She told me 2 days before she died she couldn't wait to meet Jesus. So I use her as my touchstone often in terms of what it means. She said, God loves everybody, no exceptions. So I'm more outspoken than Sherrod probably on some of these. We were just joking the other day. Sherrod is trying to stay out of the primaries, while his wife's going on every national show imaginable and saying, Hillary, Hillary, Hillary. And his office is right across from Senator Clinton's. So every time I'm on another show, the chief of staff comes running over and says, she told Terry Gross she's for Hillary. And Sherrod called me and said, baby, I just wish you'd give me a heads up.
Mr. Evelyn, please.
Could you talk about the path you followed in journalism before you became a columnist? What shaped your thinking?
Sure. Thanks for asking. As I said, I was the first in my family to go to college, and I didn't know at first I was going to major in journalism until I met with my guidance counselor in high school. And the thing is, because my dad hated his job so much, I didn't know you could love what you do for a living. And so when the guidance counselor asked me what I wanted to be, I said, well, I think I'll be a social worker. I really want to help people. I want to, you know, save the world. And he said, you're going to burn out on that. And he looks down and he looks at my scores and he says, you know, you got great scores in English and writing. Have you ever thought about going into journalism? And he could tell by the look on my face, and he said, Connie, you better love what you're going to do. You're going to be doing it for a long time. And it was the first time anyone had ever told me that what you're good at is what you could do for a living. You know, so I went to journalism school at Kent State University because Dad did a 90-mile radius around our house. That was as far as I could go. And I have in my column for Friday coming out that I drove home one day. I had a Pontiac Le Mans, an old beaten-up car that my dad got me. And I had a bumper sticker that lasted about the time it took me to leave Kent State and get home. Because I pulled in the drive, and the bumper sticker, in very bold letters, said, journalists do it daily. And in fine print, it said, support the First Amendment. He said, off. And I said, Dad, he goes, you take that off or you're walking back to school. Well, I figured he had the keys and the title, and I had earth shoes. Ain't no way I was walking 90 miles. So after I graduated, I made the mistake of, we were just talking about this at dinner with another young woman here who's the first in her family. When you come from the working class, your parents have all these great intentions. They want you to go. They have no idea how to direct you then. They don't know how to help you with the application process. They don't know how to help you make decisions when you graduate. So I'm thinking, I had an offer from the Indianapolis Star. My mother said, you're not leaving the state, are you? So there, you know, and I immediately thought, I can't leave the state. I got to be there for my parents. So I went to law school, married my law professor. Do not do that, young women in the audience. Do not do that. But started freelance writing. So I was a freelance writer for about 15 years before I started at the Plain Dealer. I was 36 years old when I got my first newspaper job. My husband filed for divorce two months later. He said, the job or me? And I thought, I know that deal. I'm going for the paper. And it was a very hard marriage. I don't mean to make light of it. It was a very difficult time in my life. But I was so nervous at first when I started at the Plain Dealer. I had written for the New York Times Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, Cosmo. Don't hold that against me. What was I thinking? But they would buy my essays that I'd already written and pay me $2,000. That was a lot of money in the late 80s. I couldn't believe it. So when I started at the Plain Dealer, you know, when you start at that age, you got a lot of people saying, who is this? They hardly ever hired freelancers. And I was on page one all the time because I thought, you know what? As I remember saying to an editor once, I almost lost my column right before I won the Pulitzer. Isn't that ironic? He said he didn't like what I was writing, and he said, you are not the working class. You are an intellectual. And I said, I'm an intellectual from the working class. We have smart people too. And then and one of the things I thought I needed to make really clear, I had to fight for the custody of my daughter. There's nothing I'm afraid of. And I think it really helped my journalism. But when I first started, I was so scared. I was 36 years old with all these people who had made a career out of this working in newsrooms, and newsrooms are mean places sometimes. I heard that they were, one of the jokes used to call me Connie Tyler Moore, because I was cheerful. And so you just got to learn to kind of roll with it. So that's what I did. And I wanted to be a columnist for years. They wouldn't let me. The editor who finally let me had said to me, I don't think you have it in you, but somebody else wants you to do it, so I'm going to let you do it. And I just finally said, I don't need you to read it. I don't need you to like it. I'm just glad you got out of the way so I could do it. And I have 2 lines of a Lucille Clifton poem. Lucille Clifton is an African-American poet. And I have it on both my desktops because I feel like it really drove me. It's what they call you is one thing. What you answer to is something else. And I knew what I could do. And I also knew I couldn't travel much. I gave up a lot. I never went to bigger papers because my daughter, it was just my daughter and me. My son was grown. And I didn't want to lose a network of family and friends. And people kept saying, it is the death knell of your career that you don't get out of Cleveland. So I think it really matters that you follow your heart on this stuff. I say it to people all the time about any career move. I can't believe I get to do this for a living. I love it. Thanks for asking.
Martha? Yes.
You spoke a bit about the women who have come before us, their sacrifices and their words of wisdom. Mm-hmm. What one piece of advice would you give to the women who are coming after us?
Well, I would encourage them to keep that one hand back, to pull along the next. I want them to think about their legacy always. And one of the things I would tell them is what I've told many people who go through. When I was first working at the Plain Dealer, I had a boss who was really awful. And he loved to embarrass me in front of people. And one day, and I knew I had the story the way it should be, and he said, I want you to do it this way. And I said, but I was the one who reported it. And he said to me, this is your job. And I walked back to my desk, and I thought about it for a moment. And I walked back up. I was really nervous. And I went up to him and I said, you know what, just so we're clear on this isn't my job. This is my career. And I walked back. You know how your knees are shaking? I think, well, I did that, even if I get fired. At least I told him. But the point of that is this. It goes back to what I just said about Lucille Clifton. For young women, I'm very concerned that, first of all, young women don't have a sense of our history that has given them these incredible opportunities that I couldn't have even imagined at their age. I am so grateful that they have these. But I'm also concerned in our current culture and our climate that it's going backwards. It's emphasizing too much how you look again. And we're giving it all away for free. And to me, you are such precious creatures, you young men and women. And we are really going to need you. This country really needs your wisdom and your experience, and we need your commitment and your passion. We were talking earlier about a lot of journalism students. The reason they won't go into it is they want to have a real life. And as torn as I am about that, I really think those are very good priorities in terms of wanting not to just live for work. But it really comes down to what someone said to me when I was younger. You better love what you do, because you're going to be doing it for a long time. And you switch jobs. I mean, I understand that you can do career, but ultimately, you got to know who you are and pursue that, because that's how you end up happy at whatever it is you're doing. And people have such expectations of young women now, and so many that are so low compared to what women are capable of doing. So that's what I would say is, know thyself.
We have time for one more question.
You, as a journalist, kind of bring a unique, approach to how do you deal with your personal life. You were a journalist before you married, a politician, and you had to talk about politicians and this and that. It seems to me that so much of politics now is driven by, gee, is this person gay? Is this person Catholic? Is
Right.
this person, their kid smoked marijuana? Have you changed since this campaign as far as what you think the media should approach the private lives of people running campaign or running for office, i.e., how far should the media go into the private life of somebody running for Senate in Ohio? I'm asked that in a variety of ways a lot, and I understand why I am. And
there's a part of me that just feels that horse has already left the gate. And there is not anything that is allowed to be secret when you are running for public office or you are married to somebody who's running for public office. And the way I've decided to look at this is this. You don't do anything you wouldn't want to read about on page 1. And actually, that's a pretty good code of ethics to live by. And do I resent it sometimes? Sure. What I'm more fearful of is the stuff the manufactured stuff that isn't true. And you see that sometimes in blogs especially, and you end up battling that. But I just don't think we're entitled to it. I will say, as a journalist, I feel emboldened to ask tougher questions of elected officials now because I know the life. And boy, I feel like the radar has become honed to, the BS out there and so you can push it a little bit. And also, when Sherrod was first, right before he was elected, some journalists, usually men, actually always men, but that's okay, would ask, can you still do this job if your husband's elected to the Senate? And actually, Leonard Pitts was the one that finally, he loved it. Leonard and I were co-hosting a panel discussion because I had all these journalism commitments before Sherrod decided to run, and a guy gets up, and it's a packed house of journalists, and he says, can you do this job if your husband's elected? I said, well, you know what? Well, you're on to me. And you could just see women lean back and fold their arms because they figured we were going to have a conversation. And I said, I don't really write my column. You know what I do? I get up in the morning, I think I'm going to write about labor today. I'm going to write about labor. So I say, honey, what do you think? And he talks and talks, and I take, because he goes on and on and on. And I take notes for about 45 minutes, and then I transcribe it, type it up, turn it in, and then I got a whole lot more time to go shopping. And I was never asked that question again. Thanks a lot for coming, folks. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.